welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today we have part 2 of our conversations with Dr. Lewis Gordon. I'm really excited for today's conversation to continue on what was a really enlightening conversation last time. How are you doing today?
I'm all right. I'm delighted to be here. And I got to add that I love the fact that you call it re-educating, because in truth, anybody who thinks they're educated is full of themselves. To, to be, it's a process of ongoing practice. To be educated is to be constantly working at being educated, which means you're
Mm.
re-educating. It's an ongoing task.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I think, yeah, thanks. Now I say it more and more because it's, becoming more of a brand, something that I represent. And when I use the word re-educated a lot, I think it brings up a visceral reaction in a lot of people of just like, why is it that I need to be re-educated? Or what does that even really mean? And I think that's one of my favorite parts about the name. The longer I kind of, throw that word around and I think about it, I'm like, re-educated is actually a very beautiful phrase. And I'm excited. I don't know what came across my mind when it came to me, but I'm really glad I chose that as the name.
Well, I like it. It's yeah, and the very fact that they pause and so forth will compel them to reflect on their presuppositions of their completeness.
Hmm.
It's a good idea for us to be reacquainted as well with our humanity, which is linked to our humility.
Hmm. So I'm really excited for today's conversation. Last time we spoke a lot into the history of race, kind of understanding and fleshing out how do we get to where we are today. And I thought it was really cool to connect and hear the historical perspective of how we got to our conceptions of race today. Over the last month it's been since we last spoke, I've been in Puerto Rico, which is a very different racial climate and composition of people than when I'm back in California, which has been really nice. And I've been thinking a lot about this concept of racism, especially with the elections coming up for the presidential race. This word often gets thrown around, which is you're racist, right? And that's always been a term that's been something that I've been fascinated by and always wanted to understand because it's a word that carries a lot of weight, particularly in the US context. And when it's used, I think it can often make people feel really badly about themselves. And so it's this word that carries a lot of weight. And so I wanted to first start there and kind of get a deeper understanding of what does it mean to be racist? We spoke of what race is and its impacts on people's experience of society, but I'm very curious to understand now this concept of being racist.
Okay, well, already already you've actually raised three considerations, right? There's race, and race by itself. Uh, we already talked about that history, but in the end, there are so many ways that people get get pigeonholed or defined, etc. And they're not always bad. I mean, sometimes, for instance, to be listed, say, as a professor or whatever identity, that's a social identity, but it has very good consequences. So so there's something more than simply a definition. Racism is also very different because ironically, you can have racism even though you don't have a coherent notion of a race, even though it affects people as racialized, right? The process of racialization. But a racist is very different. So the first thing is when we describe somebody as a racist, we're describing their attitude toward a group of people. Okay? Now, when we say that, we could say it in the sense of an observation that that person has the belief that a group of people is inferior or a group of people is superior, right? That group is superior or inferior. So that's a racist view. A racialist view is different.
Mm,
A racialist view is the belief that there are races, right? And it's possible that some people, and it's really funny. Could you imagine if some of the previous hominins had not died out? Right. So when we walk around the planet today, we have Homo sapiens, we have Denisovans, we have Neanderthals, we have maybe some others that we don't know about. We have, and in other words, different species,
Mm,
right? We have some Homo erectus, stuff like that. At that point, you could say, well, there are different species of humans. Now, the thing about different species of humans, we don't know a lot about what it would be like to be around those humans, right? We only know what it's like to be hanging around Homo sapiens. And Homo sapiens, as we know, are basically of four kinds. Okay. The first kind is just the Homo sapiens from Africa. And the Homo sapiens from Africa are not what we call pure. They're basically just Homo sapiens, and there are a lot of ghost DNA in Homo sapiens. So, Homo sapiens have always been a mixed species.
mm,
Then you have the Homo sapiens who are mixed with another group of humans who moved out of Africa, the Neanderthals. And almost everybody who is descended from people who are not from people who never left Africa has some Neanderthal in them.
mm,
Okay. And then you have Denisovans. And Denisovans were more in the eastern areas of Asia. Again, there's some people who are Homo sapiens with some Denisovans mixed in with them. And then, of course, there's some people who are Homo sapiens with both Neanderthals and Denisovans mixed in with them. But as we know, it doesn't really change anything about what Homo sapiens are.
mm,
You see what I'm saying? So that already tells you something. Sometimes when we get all hung up with purity stuff, it gets weird. So, so the racialist in that sense would be like some of us, where I just describe our species. The racialists could easily have defined us not in terms of how we look morphologically, because a very dark-skinned person could meet all the criteria I just used, and a very light-skinned person could meet all the criteria I just used. So clearly, the way people look isn't it, right? And most people don't have access to people's genetic makeup to find out how many Neanderthals and Denisovans in them. But so I'm not, but what I could say is, so mixed in with that, a racialist could just be somebody who says, there are different kinds of humans still here today. Those who are mixed with those other humans and those who are not. That's just a fact. It has no superiority, inferiority mixed in it, no moral judgment in it. You're not going to say, don't have babies with them, don't touch them, keep them away. There was an old view of racialism that was similar to say that Homo sapiens have different races, just some who are dark, some who are brown, some who are light, and so forth. So that's one way of seeing things. Those racialists are very different from a racist. They could
mm,
become now a racist would listen to a racialist and say, no, 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 no. If they're going to be these different races, some have got to be better than the others.
mm,
So that's where a racist comes in. So one of the things when you say racist is it's always normative. By normative, it means it is connected to a value system. You see,
mm,
you notice, for instance, when like you and I, for instance, right? We're both men who are of South Asian ancestry. Okay. If I look at you and I look at me, so the story I just told means it's highly likely that you and I genetically have have genes in us that are from Neanderthals and Denisovans. It doesn't change a single view of us or the rest of the world about whether we're human beings. It has no value of superior or inferior. It's just a
mm,
story of the history. However, for a person who's obsessed with racial purity, they would look at you and me as something weird. And you see what I'm getting at? And
mm.
that would be a value judgment on us.
So
Well,
that's where
similarly,
one moves from
it's
a racialist to a racist.
correct. A
Mm,
racist puts a moral or hierarchical judgment on people on the basis of race. You
mm,
see? So similarly, and a racist, it's not just about, say, their view towards people who are Asian or people who are African, or if you want to use the racial terms, people who are white, black, or brown. A racist could also internally, even to their racial designation, say some people are not pure enough. A lot of people don't realize this, but there are racists who are not only against what they consider other races, they're also racists within their own racial group
Yeah.
about whether some people are pure enough.
Mm.
So that's the first thing. So when we say someone is a racist, then we're saying we're talking about a person who has an attitude toward certain people whom they consider races, and that the attitude is one of either superiority or inferiority.
Mm.
Now even with there, when we say superiority, inferiority, again, you know, it's not intrinsically, we have to tease that out. For instance, if you go to an athletic competition, you could say an individual is a superior runner to another because that person won the race.
Mm.
That's an individual. But you're not saying there that even if the person lost the race, they're superior to the person who won. You see?
Mm.
The thing about a racist that's different is that when we condemn a person for being a racist, we're saying a person has a faulty moral judgment. You see?
Mm.
The faulty moral judgment, but that's because we're saying that a non-faulty moral judgment or a good or proper moral judgment has already implicit in it the equal value of human beings. You see?
Mm.
So if you say there's an equal value of human beings, it means that a human being doesn't have to go around always proving, in other words, for a right to exist, that they could jump so high or score this score on IQ
Mm.
tests and so forth. You see? That's a different kind of a judgment. Whereas if you look at most racist beliefs, they invariably lead to a view not only of the superiority of one group over another, regardless of performance. You see? For instance, a white racist against other groups will never be convinced that whites are inferior to those groups, but in fact superior, even though you could show all the evidence that the other group may perform better. They
Mm.
usually have to retreat into some rationalization of their superiority. You know, there was a time when white racists believed that blacks could never make good athletes.
Mm.
The moment blacks showed that that was false, what the racist does is to rewrite it into taking away the value of blacks' achievement as athletes, not from individual black achievements, but to claim almost at an animal level, it must have to do with black people having more animal-like genes, something, some way to dehumanize them. You
Mm.
see? There are people who will say, well, white people are smarter. But again, you could find a whole lot of dumb white people, and you could find a whole lot of smart non-white people by the same criterion or criteria that the racists use, right? So the racists may say, well, who have the greatest intellectual achievements, or who has, you know, the highest IQ test and stuff like that. But what you find out is with all those criteria, no matter how much people try to force the evidence, you just find people achieving all those things across every race.
Mm.
So the evidence just doesn't support those claims. But what racists also do is why racist attitudes are problematic is that racist attitudes invariably try to claim there's something intrinsic about some people, something
Mm.
inside of some people, an essence, if you will, that make them superior or inferior.
Mm.
You see? The problem with that is, uh, in a nutshell, Uh, that's dehumanization in two directions. If you're going to make an intrinsic notion that there's a group of human beings superior to human beings, you might as well stop calling them human beings.
Mm,
And if you're going to make a view that some group of human beings are intrinsically inferior to you, to other human beings, you might as well stop calling them human beings. You see, in either direction, it's dehumanizing.
mm,
So the the first thing to think about when we say someone is racist, then, is that it is more than that they have a problematic form of reasoning, is that we're holding them morally accountable for a bad judgment about
mm,
their fellow human beings. Now, of course, there's some people, unfortunately, who call everybody racist in any direction when they don't like them. That's another side of it.
yeah.
Yeah, there's some people when they use the word "you're racist," it's not to describe their actual attitude or misunderstanding. It's to it's to use the word racist as an act of condemnation,
Mm,
to say you are bad. Sometimes it's even a slur, right? In the sense of and this is why some people, when they're called racist, are very defensive because they could only hear the word as a slur.
mm,
It'll be for them to hear that they're racist, they imagine would be like, say, if you're a black, to hear the N word hurled at you, or if you're a woman, to hear the B word hurled at you, or the list is long. If you're a Jew, to hear the K word, etc.
mm,
So they treat it as a slur. So they become defensive and are trying to assert the falseness or the wrongness even of making the claim. That the problem with those is they become very counterproductive because the person hurling the slur or the term, sometimes not a slur, and the person receiving it are no longer talking about their thoughts or their actions. They're just talking about being called a racist, you see?
mm,
And that's why I say that is counterproductive. I've met a lot of people who are racists because, I mean, I write on racism. I know what it is. But one of the reasons I don't devote time to it, I could describe it as racist, is because I found often that racism, uh, not in the form of an institutional racism, that's another matter, right?
mm,
Racism is an institutional situation.
mm,
It's a way a society distributes power according to race, right? That's
mm,
racism, right? Racism is what will lock off a group of people having
mm,
access, and a lot of people very undeservedly having a lot of access.
mm,
See? So that's racism. But the thing about when we use the term racist is that um, what I found, and this is not only philosophically and not only politically, but psychoanalytically, is that, and Frantz Fanon, the psychiatrist, wrote about this as well. You'll never find racists without narcissism.
mm,
In other words, racist beliefs tend to be connected to often, right? I tend to find that there are two kinds of racist beliefs. The first kind connects connects either to a highly inflated or deflated sense of self,
mm,
right? An inflated sense of self is obvious. You want to believe you're superior to others just by virtue of the group to which you belong. It's just that simple. But the deflated sense tends to be bizarrely in another direction. You want to feel sorry for yourself through membership to a particular group that you have identified as victimized.
mm,
So, for instance, there are white racists who walk around with a belief that white people are superior to all other groups. But there are also white racists who walk around with the belief that whites are the most victimized group.
Mm,
Do you see where I'm going with this? And so sometimes, paradoxically, people who valorize their victimization are hiding a deep down belief in their superiority, paradoxically, because they want to say that ultimately they should be centered, a center of value by virtue of either their superiority or their victimization.
mm,
And so ultimately, those kind of reasoning often lead to, and that's why you should focus upon them over all other groups. So almost
mm.
all racist beliefs lead to who should be at the center over everybody else. You see?
Yes.
So that's the one kind. Then there's the other kind of racist belief, racists. The other kinds of racists are more tricky, which is it's not that they are even aware that they're racists. You see? And this may sound odd to believe, but for instance, most people, if they're in a racist society, a society premised upon racism, uh, tend to be given so many advantages that they can no longer see them as advantages. They just see them
Mm,
as just normal. So for them, they may look around at the people who are not having those advantages and say, well, maybe it's because there's something wrong with those people. You see, they're not questioning the society. They're saying something's wrong with the people. And at that moment, they begin to blame the people for their condition. And they're not thinking to themselves that 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 they are ascribing to themselves being part of a superior group. They begin to try to rationalize a system by not asking themselves as honestly as they can whether if they were living under the conditions that the people they're condemning
mm,
were living under, whether they would be able to do the things they're claiming those people should do. You see?
mm,
And I'll give you an example. One time I got into a Uber with a white guy. And by the way, the stuff I'm saying is not, I'm only using white people right now because that's more familiar to the listeners. Every group, my position is a very controversial one for some because I do think there's a racism in many people who do race theory, which is some people come into race theory because they ultimately only want one group of people to be the racists and they want to exonerate
mm,
their group exclusively. I think that is
mm.
also problematic. So my actual position is, and you pick any group of people, if you set the right conditions on them, they can be racists.
Yeah.
So I got into, but I'm just using, so when I use white people, not to say white people are the exclusive people who are racist. I've met racists all over the place, right?
Mm,
In my first book, I've even talked about black anti-black racists. They're black people who actually think black people are inferior. So, as I've already said, you could be a racist inside of a group against your group.
mm,
Okay, but anyway, I had a kind of conversation with a white cab driver, a Uber driver. We were just talking about stuff, and he was from an urban area nearby, and it, he was asking. I was on the way to talk about one of my books, and he got into a race conversation, and he was saying, he's from those areas. He's a hardworking guy. Clearly, he's driving his Uber and he does this and that. And now he doesn't live there. And, so he doesn't understand, the people who just stay in poverty and stay in those neighborhoods, those black neighborhoods or those Hispanic neighborhoods, as he said, and, stay that way in poverty, why don't they work hard like him? And you've probably heard people say stuff like that in many
many.
contexts.
Yeah.
And so I said to him, well, you're making, so I said to him, instead of me saying, oh, you're a racist, stop this car, let me get out of it. You know what I mean? I said, well, when did you live in that neighborhood? He said, about 15 years ago. I said, okay. So it means when you live there, one of the things when you live in the poor area, your goal was to move out of it. And he said, yeah. Well, I said, well, when you moved out, other people moved in, didn't they? And he said, yeah. Well, if other people moved out when you moved in, why is that urban area still having a white neighborhood, a black neighborhood, a Hispanic neighborhood, right? So basically white, black, and brown, right? And in between they're Asians in different groups. And he said, well, because some of them don't work as hard as you to move out. I said, well, I've been living in this area for 30 years. And I've lived in the country we're talking about for, at that point of the conversation, for 51 years. And I said, I've gone back to all the neighborhoods because when I first moved to the country, I was poor. I was an immigrant, and we live in a poor neighborhood. But you know what all poor people are trying to do? Get the hell out of a poor neighborhood.
Mm,
So if we go and look back into those neighborhoods, I pointed out that the neighborhood he's talking about during the periods of Maya and his childhood and adolescent years were mostly Irish and Italian. Before that, it was German and Irish. And if you go right now, most of the whites are not German, Italian, or Irish, or even Ashkenazic Jewish. Those whites are, sorry, I should have turned off my, if you heard a bing sound, that was my
mm-mm,
email. Oh, you didn't. Good.
no.
I heard it, so I'll get out of it. I said, if you go in there right now, the people you're seeing are Albanians,
Mm,
Croatians, Slovenians. They're the
mm,
new white immigrants, and they're living there because they're poor. And
mm,
eventually, if they can make enough money to move out, they'll move out, and another group goes in. And I said, similarly, when I was a kid, the blacks who were there were blacks, U.S. blacks from the South, and Jamaicans. Now, if you go there, they're Nigerians, Liberians. They
mm.
are
So it's changing.
It's right. So if you look at it racially, it looks the same. Even when you say Hispanics or Latinos, when I was younger, they were just Puerto Ricans. Then they became Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. Now you go
Mm,
there, they're Peruvians, Guatemalans, and so forth. And it makes sense, right? If you're a Guatemalan, you're going to go in a poor neighborhood where people who speak Spanish.
mm,
That's all. And eventually your children will grow up Americans and be bilingual or, whatever. Similarly, if you're black, you're going to go in the area where you see black people, but you're not thinking at that moment that that's what it is, even though you're a Nigerian or Liberian or Ethiopian.
mm,
So the problem, and he began to see the point that he is imposing upon, he's thinking he's talking about the same people.
mm.
Now, racially, they're listed as the same, but it's not the same people. Ethnically, it's always changing. You see? So
Yes.
the real issue is that he's missing is what's going on with a city that happens to just keeping in the same spaces, whites, blacks, and browns.
Mm,
Something else must be going on to affect their mobility. You see what I'm saying? And so, in other words, why isn't it more mixed? That is the question. So the thing about race discussions is racist, rather, let me back up, racist discussions never ask about how as human beings, behave under similar circumstances. This
mm,
this fellow was first of all believing that
mm,
he is like all white human beings, but there are white people still living there. Now, right?
mm,
Second, he fails to, and this is something goes back to W.B. Du Bois's research, the African American sociologist and philosopher and economist and a lot of stuff. W.B. Du Bois said, what a racist does is to turn a people into a problem. What that got cab driver, that Uber driver was saying is that those people are the problem, not the city that separates them in that way and lock them in poverty. Du Bois says if you can understand them as human beings, you realize they're not the problems. The problem is the city or the society that does that to them. Because the individual people are trying their best to live into better conditions. And we know this because it was funny. When I went to New York recently to give a talk in a college that when I lived in New York was just anybody black you would meet was either again a Caribbean or US born black who's now mostly Africans, right? Direct from Africa. The question is, where did all those Caribbeans go? Well, if you
Mm,
go to New York now, that part of the Bronx, most of those Caribbean people have moved. They're now living in Mount Vernon, which is a suburb area, York, Yonkers, or they've moved entirely out of New York City. You see what I'm saying? In
mhm,
other words, they do what normal poor people who achieve middle class status do. They go
mm,
and find affordable middle class homes. So a lot of race discourses people talk about, unfortunately, through stereotypes. You see, and if you and this guy began to see that point, and so the point is, the question we have to ask now is this guy was this guy a racist? Right now, if I just said get the hell out of the car, that's all he would be.
mm,
Right now, if I'd had that conversation with him, and then he said, "Well, I don't buy all that crap. You all black people are just lazy and so on and so forth." Well, that's pretty clear that you got a racist. He's sticking tenaciously to his beliefs. However, if he comes out of the car thinking, I'm going to have to rethink the way I think about how people are doing, because he's saying those black and brown people are just like me in the sense that they're just doing different things in different parts of the place. Or maybe I'm just like them, which is there may be black and brown people who moved out and say, I'm the good ones. I work hard. I moved out. Those people there are the lazy bad ones. But that's again, you see how racism inside of a group can work. So there's so many ways to look at it. So what is this guy? I don't know. But what I do know is that his beliefs were based on a lot of fallacious forms of reasoning, a lot of faulty reasoning.
mm.
You see, and he might be a racist, he may not be, but I don't think we're using the term racist productively if
Yeah.
it's meant to just shut things down and separate people. We need to
Yes.
find a way to get people to, as your program is named, re-educate themselves,
Yeah.
because it's clearly that dude had some kind of education, but it was miseducation. It was a faulty form of education.
Mm.
But he needs to get a kind of more critical education that may make him ask himself with less arrogance, but with humility, I believe this, but is it true? What's
Yeah.
maybe there's something wrong with what I believe.
So, because the reason I wanted to focus on this topic, and I think it's very important when we talk about history, and I'm going to try to piece together this idea. Let me know if it makes sense. And this is where a lot of my interest and curiosity into this question comes. In my experience, and this might be, the wrong take or hot take, but in my experience, I don't think I have yet to meet a single person who I would deem to have overcome racist thoughts or racism as a concept. I don't, I to this day don't think I've met a single person. And before I kind of explain that, I think one of the things, and you were talking about this earlier, I think so often people respond so strongly to the word being called racist that they have hardly enough time to really like sit and ponder upon, okay, what forms of my thinking may be deemed racist, which I think is one of the big problems. We've kind of turned this word into a binary where you're either racist or you're not a racist. And I feel that across the board, and this is kind of where my interest is in some ways, I feel like everybody feels a lot more comfortable around people who look similarly to them. And it's not just because they look like them, it's because they may dress the same, they may eat the same foods. There's a whole list of a deeper understanding of their background that allows people to feel more comfortable with people who've been raised similarly. In this country, it happens to be along the lines of race, but in a different context, it could be something completely different. It could be, I mean, your socioeconomic status is another big one. It could be, the types of training or schools that you go to. There's a whole large list of things that could make you more similar to another person. But in the US, it happens to be race. And so, regardless of where I've been, I've always found that people feel safer when they're around people that look like them. And so, what ends up happening is because of that, I think people feel often because they feel more comfortable, they also end up liking their own groups or people a bit more as well. And so then we were talking about it earlier, which is at some point it carries over to I feel more comfortable around my people to then I think my group of people are superior in some way or another. And that is why I also feel more comfortable around them. I guess my question is it possible to have, okay, I feel comfortable around people who look like me and separate that from more of these like hierarchical thinking where you're like, okay, well, I believe that this group is better than the other group.
Well, there's several things. The first thing is part of the long history of racism has socialized a lot of us to believe that similitude or similarity is the fundamental category for comfort versus discomfort.
Hmm.
Uh, but actually, a lot in history doesn't actually show that. Uh, you would find, for instance, there is no such thing as a human community without internal conflicts. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that there are people who there and not every there are some people who tend to feel most comfortable being around their group or the people who are most like them. And there's some people who are at the most dis-ease, the most discomfort around being around their group and the
Hmm.
people like them. And in other words, a lot of the story depends on the history and a variety of commitments of the groups to which they belong. In fact,
Hmm.
some people when they meet their people, so to speak, they get PTSD.
Hmm.
Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing is if it were really true that we really are fundamentally about our similarity versus our differences. A lot of historical encounters of different groups and kinds of people would have been initial encounters immediately of violence, when in fact, a lot of history has shown that mixtures and learning each other's language and a lot happens very quickly. And one of the biggest sources of evidence of this, of course, is trade. And I'm not talking about the way capitalists talk about trade. I'm talking about trade going back more than 100, maybe like 400,000 years of different kinds of trade. You see?
Hmm. Hmm.
So whenever hominins meet one another, uh, um, not only mixing occurs, but all kinds of adaptations and transformations of language and so forth.
Hmm.
In fact, even curiosity, titillation, attraction, all kinds of things occur to the point where many groups have to develop ideological barriers to tell members of their group that they're not supposed to like or desire people in another group. You see,
Hmm.
if think about it, if people so naturally didn't desire or have connections to people who are different, we wouldn't have to create rules to keep them apart.
Hmm.
They'll just naturally do it. It doesn't happen. So that's the first thing we should bear in mind. The other thing we should bear in mind is that not, as you were pointing out, I think rather astutely, not a lot of the things that people think are the signs of difference are what the people who see differences think are the sign of difference. And or the signs of similarity. So, for instance, I'm Jewish. I am Tamil. I am a lot of things. I'm Ethiopian, etc. Right? But it's rather interesting. My wife is also Jewish. Now, what's interesting is for a person who look at skin color as the primary marker, they would see my wife and me as an example of difference, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
However, the people who see internal to Jewish communities, my wife and me, and can spot things, can see my wife and me as not different.
Hmm.
As you see what I'm getting at?
Hmm.
But then even within Jewish communities, because she's Ashkenazi and I'm what's called Mizrahi and
Hmm.
Sephardic, if you're going to be Ashkenazic centric, then we are different. Do you see what
Hmm.
I'm getting at? But
Yes.
so an observer will come out and say, well, what's your beef for the people who are complaining? One person could say, what are you talking about? That's a Jewish couple. And then the ones who have a problem say, yeah, but it's not the kind of Jewish couple we want, right?
Correct.
Because
So
right, Oh, but I was just going to say, so as we go with it, there are a lot of those things. But here's the thing I was just going to say about the similarity and the difference thing. Um, the thing to bear in mind is that we should, well, I'll just make it very quick. We should naturalize, right, presuppositions of
Mm,
similarity because there are things that we do like that are based on similarity that do make sense, right?
mm,
For instance, you're going to have a better time playing basketball with people who like to play basketball.
mm,
You're going to have a better time eating at a vegetarian restaurant with people who like vegetables. You see what I mean? So there are things that it's better done when shared, but there's something that's also better done through having differences. And among those things is, I'll give just one that's related to what this program's about is growth. If you're always around people like you don't grow. There has to be a point of difference in to facilitate growth, learning, changing.
yeah. Even as you're saying, I'm trying to do better at like collecting my thoughts as I listen because it's hard to do both sometimes. But something you were saying, and I'm curious, I want to hear what your opinions are on this. I feel like in all the things that we're talking, there's like I'm going to use the word spiritual and define what that means, but I feel like there's a spiritual component to it, and then there's a racial component to it. And so, and this is what I mean. So let's say I'm a person who believes that picking up trash is like the most useful thing a human can do with their life, and the more they pick up trash, the better they are. Like as a like the value of their life itself increases. And a lot of people have different things for them. It might be being healthy. It might, everyone has some sort of model for what a good life is. And so what ends up happening, I think often, is that people then try to surround themselves with people that they think are quote unquote better, and that aligns with a bunch of certain actions. Then what ends up happening is if the people that you end up finding happen to align based on race or whatever it groups by, that's how you start abstracting and generalizing people as a whole. And so I think what you said earlier was a really good point, where is that based on how astutely you want to look at differences, you can find different lines to group and separate people. You can say, hey, you guys are all Americans. But then, that would be including a large number of us. But then you can, become more specific and say, well, you are white, you are Indian. You can get, and then you can get more specific in that you are South. And what I'm trying to say is the spiritual part of this seems to be where you treat all people as equal, regardless of the decisions that they make, regardless of any of those. You just think all humans are equal. And then the racial element of that is simply just not thinking that the differences are based on race. But you're allowed to still think the differences are based on height or the differences are based on something else. But simply, you just shouldn't think that it's based on race. But you're still allowed to think that people are different and there are values based on each person. Does that make sense? Like there is, you can you wouldn't necessarily think that the reason people are different are because of race, but you would still be saying that there are differences in people and there are differences in values. And that seems to also be in some ways a suboptimal form of thinking, but it just has nothing to do with race. Does that kind of make sense what I'm saying?
Well, it does. The, you know, you're identifying and something that is profoundly normal, but also your use of the word spiritual isn't off. Uh, the problem is in the English language, we don't have the right word for it. You see, for instance, in other languages, you have a term for something that is talking about what makes you fundamentally enter a form of intimate relationship with other human beings or with reality that connects you. You
Mm,
see, in
mm,
German, it's the Germans use the word Geist.
mm,
Now, but I think a person who beautifully articulates this is the late great philosopher Martin Buber. You
mm,
see, Martin Buber points out that when we say I, we have this sort of intimate spiritual relationship. He doesn't call it spiritual there, but when we say I, we have this sense of us ourselves just in the world, looking at the world.
Mm,
Okay. And we have the sense that, we're being alive, the world is disclosed to us, etc. But when we look at the rest of the world, we can look at the rest of the world in ways that are superficial, that are surface, as if there's nothing inner. And he calls that it, right? Right. We look at the world as things. I could talk about, for instance, when I hold up this book, I look at it. Or I could walk in the street and look at a tree and say, look at it, it's a tree, right? We do that all the time. But we also do that to people. There are times we unfortunately look at people as it, right?
mm,
We use terms that look at people superficially, surfacely. But then Buber points out but there are these moments we have an encounter, okay? When we have an encounter, it's not as an it is as a you. All
mm,
right. It's a moment where, for instance, if you're walking on the street and people flowing by you are just surface people, but you're trying to find your way somewhere. So you stop someone and say, and someone taps you on the shoulder, I'm sorry, I'm a bit lost. Could you tell me how to find this street? Now, at this moment, the person you're about to walk by is just a part of the ebb and flow of just things. But when that person turns around, you look in the person's eye, and the person's not a thing. The person's a you. And
mm,
what do you say? You say, "Oh, you turn left, make a right, and look for the sign that says blah blah blah. That'll get you there." Now, at
mm,
that moment, that person is an encounter. You see, and there are many examples of this. Now, what's interesting is I give my students this example too. You could be invited to a party, it's loud, the music's going, everything, and you go out for some fresh air. And at that moment, you didn't realize it, but everybody at the party is like an it. They're just jumping around, they're just things, they're people, but and then somebody else was couldn't stand the noise and sat down and sweating, and you sit next to each other, you're like, oh, you had to get some air. Yeah, before you know, you're talking. What's interesting is that conversation now that begins, you may talk with a person and suddenly a door opens and you hear the loud music and they say, we were looking for you. Where'd you go? And you didn't realize the person you sat down to talk with at the party, you thought you sat down with this person for, like 2 minutes. And the reason your friends came out and say, hey, where were you? Where have you been looking all over you? Is because you sat down with this other person at the party and you were talking for 2 hours or
mm,
30 minutes.
mm,
Whenever you encounter people as you, not it, as things, time is different.
mm,
Because,
100%.
and that's why I said your use of spiritual is correct. Because you see, what happens there, and there are others, there's a philosopher, Bergson, who talks about as durée. You have entered a shared world of meaning. And
Mm,
in that shared world of meaning, everybody, the person with whom you're speaking is not somewhat, is absolutely important. In
mm,
fact, that's why the rest of the party disappeared. Everything, the conversation took over.
yeah,
You see?
yes.
Now, what Buber noticed is, and why, again, you saying it's spiritual is correct. He noticed, however, that this can happen to non-human relations, that you
Mm,
can walk and stop and have and realize a tree as an encounter, not as an
mm,
it, but a you. And I remember this. I talk about this with my students. I remember I used to live in a house in a park that had a lot of trees. When I would go to do my work, I would see the trees, but because back then I had a near photographic memory, every time I would look up, I would have remember where everything is. I began to notice something peculiar. So I started taking pictures of it. And I began to notice that whenever I came to work, it looked like the trees turned around and were looking at me.
mm,
And so I took pictures and said, and I noticed the pictures verified that the trees shifted their orientation. And I began to realize that the trees were like a U. And it changed my whole relationship to plants. But what's interesting is a group of tornadoes went through the park one summer and decimated a lot of the trees. And I was so horrified by this. I went outside, and what I saw was that almost all the residents who lived in the park were hugging and holding the trees. And I
Hmm.
realized I wasn't alone in that experience. The trees were you. Buber did ask the next move. He said, because he believed in God. Well, you don't have to believe in God for this, but he believed in God. Buber's asked, how does God see all of reality? And Buber's answer is, God would see all of reality as you, not as it. You see.
Hmm.
So if we come back then, um, yeah, when we walk around, there are all kinds of things that differentiate us, right? But this spiritual you that connects us, it's not something that makes us a kind of sameness that align. The argument is not to say to eradicate the differences, because this encounter is so powerful and so connecting that it's not about sameness. You see what I'm getting
Hmm. Yes.
at?
Yes.
It's about connectedness.
Yeah.
It,
I want to add one thing because I think what you've just said, I think summarizes what I was trying to say, which is that it feels that the truest form to leaving past, racism and the differences in which we kind of erect between us is these form of interactions and connections. For when you get to move past the differences and truly see an individual for who they are, which is this infinitely complex being that like is like no other, and every human is kind of like that, then all of a sudden all these fears and things that you've built up throughout your life just cease to exist and you're able to see a person for a person. But I guess the reason I think it's so important is that to get to this point isn't simply to like be like, okay, well, we shouldn't look at race, but it's okay for us to look at intellect. Like we're allowed to view people differently based on their capacity for, intelligence or for their height. And because then all we do is we switch out our modality of difference making from race to simply just something else, which I think doesn't solve the deepest underlying problem, which is disconnection between humans.
yeah, in fact, in my writings, I actually argue against the view that we erase race or gender or any of those. What we need to do is defang them, right? Take away what makes them noxious. So, for instance, if someone has to not see me as black in order to respect me, that person has a problem with blacks.
Mm,
If I have to not see a woman as a woman in order to respect her, I have a problem with women.
mm,
You see?
yes.
Um, However, if I understand that every woman, every black person, every queer person, every trans person, every whatever category we choose, I meet, that when I meet them, it is only part of them,
Mm,
right? In order for me to have that encounter, I have to be able to see the other dimensions of them. You
well
see?
said.
And I
Yes.
may and I may learn about that dimension of them in a very different way. You see?
Yeah.
Because I may learn things. So, I mean, it's funny. I once taught at a Midwestern university that it was a very famous Midwestern university. So it had people who came from the East Coast and people who came from farms in the Midwest. What I found that was very amusing, what rather revealing, was the worst racial experiences I had there were from the East Coast white people who came to the Midwest to study there.
Mm,
The farm people, the local ones, uh, I had the best racial experiences with. And this may sound
mm,
shocking, right? But it turned out to be this. There was a kind of arrogance from the East Coast whites because they already grew up in environments with the police and all kinds of other things with certain kinds of conflicts around race, and they have well-formed racist beliefs.
mm,
A lot of the white farm kids who came to that university grew up with people saying all kinds of racist things about Black people, but they never really met Black people.
Mm,
So they were more aware that their racial beliefs and racist beliefs were were imagined ones. So what tended to happen was when they suddenly had a Black professor in front of them, they kept trying to figure out, why did I hear
mm,
all these things, but I keep seeing a human being?
mm,
You see what I'm saying? Whereas the others had developed a set of resources, the ones from the East Coast, and how to keep them not seeing human beings. You see? So Gabe Kaplan, the comedian, had a funny joke about it. There's a pejorative Ashkenazi term for Blacks. It begins with an S. And when he was a little boy, he said, is the building, a lot of the neighbors were complaining because the S's were moving in. There's an
mm,
S family moving, right? They kept saying the S, but he's a little boy and he heard all these horrible things. The building's going to fall apart. There's going to be all kinds of crime, things happening in the building. So he was worried about his neighbors, you know? So when the day came from the dreaded S's to move in, right? It's the Yiddish version of the N word. He put on his football helmet, he got his baseball bat, he got ready, and he ran outside to protect his house, his apartment building. And he said, and when he ran out, he said he saw these Black people coming up, and he ran up to them and he said to them, "Hurry, run in the building for safety. The S's are coming." I think so. I don't want to romanticize Midwest farm people, but I think the ones I met, because part of dealing with racism, if you're going to be what some people call anti-racist, is you don't want to overgeneralize about people. There
mm,
are there, but what I don't want to overgeneralize is the view that about where racists are. The truth is, there are racists all over the place, and there are people who are not racist all over the place. And we don't want to overgeneralize places. So in the Midwest, there are people who are racist, and there are people who are not, just like in the East Coast, in the South, in different countries, in Russia, in China, in India, in South Africa. Everywhere I've gone, I've met people who are not racist, and I've met people who are racists.
mm,
You see? And then there are times I get surprised. I remember my first time in Belgrade, in Serbia. I went to catch the plane, and one of the things you know if you grow up in the U.S. is racist comportmentation,
mm,
right? For the listeners, comportmentality is how you organize your body according to your beliefs. That's how we
mm,
learn. That's how we learn to read people. You know what I mean? You know, like my wife's parents are from South Africa. My wife was born in Manchester, England, and she grew up in the south side of Chicago. And my wife's a professor. She was at a conference recently, and she was in the audience, and there was a Black South African woman speaking. And the Black South African woman looked at my wife, and in the middle of, her big talk, this woman looked at my wife and said, "You're South African, are you?"
mm,
Now my wife grew up in the United States, and right, but she grew up visiting her grandparents and stuff in South Africa. Her parents are South African, and my wife wasn't wearing a sign, but the woman was completely correct. And what's interesting, you know the traumatic history of South Africa.
mhm,
That woman looked at her lovingly and was so happy to see a South African there.
mm,
And they began to speak. And there were also Black South Africans in the audience. But what's interesting is there were other people in the audience who would be legally designated as white, but she didn't call them South African. You see what I'm trying to get at? She was able to tell by comportmentation or comportmentality what a person whose parents is South African would be like in a
mm,
room. And I'm sure Brazilians do it all the time. There are lots of groups who do it, right? So I bring this up because as the white people were getting on the plane, I expected the comportmentalization of people who are racist because I was connecting with people for coming from the United States, etc. But when I was in Frankfurt, as those people were getting, and there was only one other black person on the plane, was a young black guy who, he was chill. He was just relaxed. But this was my first time going to Serbia. And I looked and I noticed there's something just odd about the way these white people behaved. I began to realize, okay, these are Serbian white people. You know what I mean? But there was just something I couldn't quite spot. And they didn't have what I call the this is a black guy getting on the plane with me way of moving. In other words, they were as indifferent to me being on the plane as they were indifferent to any other person going on the plane. Everything, including the way the stewardesses were, and so I'm wondering, right? What this is a very interesting experience. And this was years ago, right? I'm speaking now as a much older man. This is when I was a much younger man. This is years ago. So when I got to Serbia, this is before I became an American citizen. This is how far back this was. I had a Jamaican passport. So when I get to the customs, the guy said, okay, show me your passport. So at this moment, I'm already off balance because I've just been in a plane where there are only two people of color, one black guy and me, and everybody else is white. And none of us had that kind of orientation of whiteness, you know what I mean? Of there are two black men on the plane type thing. And when I turned, when the guy said, show me your passport, and then he paused for a long while, I said, aha, this is the racial moment. And he looked at me and he goes, I've never seen a Jamaican passport before. That's what he said.
Mm.
He said, wow, for him, the excitement was he'd never seen a Jamaican passport. He
Mm.
wasn't thinking about seeing a black man or this. He was thinking about the passport. And then he says, welcome to Serbia. Next. And I was like, whoa. So, and this, by the way, went on for quite a while until finally it was around, and this relates to what I say, the distinction between racism and racists. It's not that there are no racists in Serbia or anywhere like that, but what's interesting, after a while, I kept seeing all these Serbs, and some of the Serbs were brown, some were light, some were blonde, some were blue. All these people who are Serbs of different kinds, but they're all Serbs. So finally, I said to my host, I got to ask you all, in my head, in my imagination, Serbia, because in American movies and stuff, they stereotype it where you think you're in Russia. A lot of Serbian people are more like Mediterranean people. So that's one
Ah.
thing that's off. I know, because when I said Serbia, you were also thinking like, I comrade, Russian, No, no, no. The Serbians are not like Russians, right? Because they're called Slavic, people think that way. They're very, very much like Mediterranean people. So that's one stereotype out the window. But the other thing that blew me away was just seeing all these people. I said, if I were to just look morphologically, I would think I was in Latin America. To me, a lot of them look like where you are now. I thought a lot of them were Puerto Rican or, because I've gone through Latin America. And I was looking like, they look like the range from light to dark Puerto Ricans, and
Mm.
so forth. And so I'm trying to figure out what the hell's going on here. So I finally asked, I said I had a lot of stereotypes of Serbs, but and again, part of if you're combating racism is to be truthful when you have stereotypes, right? So I said, and then they said to me, oh, well, Serbians are actually more like Mediterranean people, but in its history under communism, there was a real effort to have people from all over the world come and study in Yugoslavia.
Mm.
So a
Mm.
lot of the people you're seeing, there are people who are not mixed. Serbs are mixed people, and some are more mixed with other kinds of Slavs and so forth. But you are also seeing people who are mixed with Asians and Africans and Caribbeans and so forth. They are. It's just that in Serbia, they're Serbs. That was it. And
Mm.
so in other words, the policies, this is where it shows that a political intervention into racism that normalizes connectedness of people can lead to a national identity that is not, in other words, they weren't saying that those are the mixed race Serbs, the brown race, you know what I'm saying? They
Mm.
were just saying those are Serbs. You see?
The
So
identity
when
itself, yeah. I mean, it's like saying African American rather than just American.
correct, and there it was. And so I bring that up because I wish more people who write on race would travel. They would learn a whole lot of things because I think the last time we got together, I'd said to you the people who think they're blacks are the blacks, they're Jews are the
Mm,
Jews, they're Asians are the Asians. No, there aren't. There are many ways to live as those identities across the world. And if
mm,
and if we learn, if we're going to be experts on these, we should learn the communities we're actually talking about. You see?
mm,
So yeah, that connectedness is another example. And again, it's not a formula, right? There are many reasons why, you could have hate groups pop up and all kinds of other things. Human groups have conflicts, you see, but we don't want to, in a hasty generalization, attribute the conflict to one specific thing. Sometimes what creates race as the explanation wasn't the original motivation,
mm,
you see. Like for instance, if we pick an example like anti-Semitism, right? Anti-Jewish hatred, there are people who who are originally, excuse me, not that way, but through various conflicts, they may hate the idea that we call them anti-Semites. But through certain conflicts, there are people who really do develop hatreds of Jews. And
mm,
there are people through different conflicts develop hatreds of Arabs and Muslims and so forth. But but when they give the reason for their hatred, they don't realize often they're given an ex post facto explanation. They're not talking about the real cause of their hatred. You see? In other words, they're trying to claim these people were bad all along.
mm,
But no, you see, there may be other reasons that started their group conflicts and varieties of other things. So I find it's very important to try to find out what's going on with behaviors of hatred. And in some cases, there are people just are haters. They're tenaciously
mm,
holding on no matter what. We can't rule that out. But in those cases, I think the solution is not about saving their souls, right? The solution is about organizing power in our society in such a way that those individuals don't commit a lot of damage.
mm. Stripping
You
the
know,
power in some ways.
yeah, yeah. Because for instance, let's just pick a ridiculous example, right? If you're a Koori in Australia, listeners may not know what that would be. That's a specific ethnic group of Aboriginals.
Mm,
For some people who are called Aboriginals prefer not to be called Aboriginals. That's why, I try my best when I'm referring to certain groups to mention the specific ethnic name. Okay. But for listeners outside of the Australian context, that's a specific group of what they outside would call Aboriginals.
mm,
If a Koori were to say, I hate white people, that is not going to change in any which way white power in South Africa. I'm not South Africa, Australia.
Australia.
Yeah, in Australia, in the United States, in Canada. I don't think white Canadians and white Australians and white Americans should be busy trying to save the soul of that person who hates them. That person does not have the power to transform the lives of white people over that. However, if certain groups of white people, such as MAGA in the United States and Donald Trump, and then continue their hatred, they want to put their hatred into policies. You see? So, them being individual racists, I don't give a damn. But them being organized racists, I do give a damn.
Mm,
Because that could lead to policies like death camps, immigration policies, unfair housing, lots of things that could lead to wars. The list is long. That could lead
mm.
to rules against who can have children, all
Yeah.
of those things. So that's why I think we need, if I go full circle, we could about race, we could about racism, and we can talk about racists,
Mm,
right? When racists are empowered, we have racism.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important conversation, primarily, and I'll ask you this last question because I think it's the most important one, and it connects us back to education. Because when I think about my exposure to racism and race, and thinking critically about that in all of my 12 years of public education, it was only the few months perhaps that we talked about slavery. And that was the extent in which the conversation was even brought up. And after slavery, history was often presented like racism just stopped really being an issue. And we had the civil rights movements and we had a few, but it seemed like a problem of the past. It wasn't something that was talked about necessarily as an ongoing complex issue. And so one question I have for you is when we talk about these things in the classroom, and this is a huge issue in education now, where a lot of people are saying that it's divisive or their children feel really guilty and they're not able to have these discussions in a meaningful way. What are your thoughts on how these topics can be introduced? And is feeling guilty going to just be a natural consequence of our history? Is it possible to have it without feeling terrible about yourself?
A lot of these people who make those claims are distorting the history of education. A good example is for since I was in elementary school, when I was in New York, we were able to talk about the Holocaust. We were able to see films on the Holocaust. We were able to see those death camps. It's a profound level of narcissism for a lot of people to take things so personally. And why I bring that up is, and this is where we go full circle. You notice that example I gave with the cab driver, not a cab driver, the Uber driver.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't being moralistic when I spoke with him. I do think it's possible to teach people the truth about history, full history. But if we go into it as proselytizers and moralizers, even if we're not talking about slavery, any topic we go in to talk about in a moralistic, self-righteous way is going to make young people wonder, am I the bad one or the good one? Am I good enough? If we go through anything in that way, we're going to create an environment in which we are going to cultivate guilt.
Mm,
Now here's the thing. The thing is, uh, there are. I think there's something wrong if we have no affect. In other words, education. We're not educating robots.
mm,
We're educating people. I think it's important for people to be moved by things that were wrong and also by things that were right. All
mm,
right. You notice when I gave the Buber example, I talk about encounter. It was not just a bland description. It's moving. It makes us understand our connectedness.
mm,
So one of the things that we should ask ourselves, and I'm not the only one to talk about this. There's a very famous, she's passed away, philosopher by the name of Iris Marion Young, who talked about these as well. Uh, it's important for us to be able to talk about the past as something we can learn from and to understand the present and the future as something to reflect critically on what we're trying to do.
mm,
If you only look at the past at something that you should feel um, a sense of moral trauma about, then you leave people immobilized. And it's not just the problem with the way some people are talking about divisiveness is they're just talking about white kids and so forth. But
mm,
there's a lot of damage done to black kids, for instance, by lying about black children's history, black people's history.
mm,
For instance, it's not just about slavery. Many people think that a group of white people became moral one day in the North and decided to get rid of slavery in the South. But
mm,
there was slavery in the North. So that's false, right? Right? That's the first part. That's wrong, right? Second part is a lot of people think black people are just sitting passively while white people fight for our freedom. That's also false. The truth of the matter is there were a lot of black soldiers in the Civil War. There were also black soldiers in the Confederate, right? So we don't
Mm-hmm.
want to romanticize it. But the fact of the matter is, everywhere I've studied slavery, enslaved people fought for their freedom.
Mm.
So first of all, there's a lot of damage in making not only white children see themselves as simply people who abuse people, but black people as seeing themselves exclusively as people who are abused.
Mm.
Both are damaging. What we need to have people understand in history is to ask themselves uh, um, very to have a sense of what it's like to live under difficult times
Mm.
when the difficult times seem in those times as ordinary.
Mm.
Because where that makes you ask about the present is that things that we think are better in the present may not be as good in the future when the present is remembered.
Mm.
You see?
Yeah.
So
Wow.
and that's how I teach history when I do teach on historical matters, right? I don't I try to make people understand that some of the people we valorize as heroes didn't know they were heroes at the time. And some of
Mm.
the people we valorize as demonic did not know that they were being demonic at the times. And some people we look at in the times in the past were horrible and knew they were horrible. And one of the reasons we know this is because some people are so over the top horrible that even the people who are on their side said, "Yo, you're horrible."
Mm.
So, but the point is, some people we look at as saints are also turn out to be quite despicable people. And
Mm.
because saintliness is also something that's also a bit inhuman, you know what I mean? Like some of the people we look at it so saintly are willing to sacrifice their whole family for their moral beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
And you got to ask yourselves, honestly as you can, what kind of people would do this? Do we want that to be the model of humankind, the kind of people who are willing to slit the throats of their daughters and their sons for the cause and all kinds of stuff? Today, we may speak that in a certain way, but what kind of people are these? Or the kind of people who may say they love God so much that they're willing to
Mm.
have 100,000 of their people die, or fine, we love Saint Thomas Aquinas, but Saint Thomas, I'm not we, but that's a saint in Catholicism, but I mean, the word has it that he was so saintly that he decided that he would castrate himself rather than fall to the whim of a prostitute
Mm.
or a sex worker. You see, and again, you know, I think when we're thinking about ethical life, we need to teach people a more reasonable way of understanding how to live as good human beings.
Mm.
So some of the things, but and this is one, it's easier for me to say because I also teach philosophy. Part of philosophy is to ask that question. But everyday history teachers who teach literature, writing, or science, that's a bit difficult because they're just trying to teach what they know, but we could at least present to them the idea that we need to have an understanding of history that is actually more human.
Mm.
That we're trying to have our students grow up to be adults who can understand what human relationships are, and that
Mm.
and that even when people commit wrong things, we're trying to create a society in which the we can have better outcomes through understanding the past rather than reveling in and fetishizing and be immobilized by the past. The past should enable us to become better people, but that requires learning the truth.
Mm. Wow. I think there was like a few points on history that you had damn you had touched upon earlier that I think are really important. One is you talked about it earlier where it was like really reflecting and thinking, have you taken the time to put yourself in the shoes of another to then comprehend whether you would act any differently had you been given those exact same circumstances. And I think that that is one really powerful way of looking at history, where it can sometimes be too easy to just be like, these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. And I think there's a fascination. I mean, when we look at superhero movies, there's this and just the movie industry in general, there's this fascination of kind of simplifying a story into these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. And when we start to do that to history as well, if that's our extent of understanding history, then we sometimes we will fall in the quote unquote bad guy side or the quote unquote good guy side. But what history really is it's a lot more complex and nuanced. There isn't really a good guy or a bad guy. It's everyone plays both roles in different times throughout history, and it really depends on who wins to retell the story, and it becomes it's a lot more complex. And I think when you approach history that way, you don't necessarily have to take it as, oh, okay, well, I'm terrible or my people are terrible, and you can understand like what parts of those things led those people to do that, and what can we do differently now so that we don't end up in those same situations again. And I think,
Yeah, we should. Yeah,
yeah.
we should ask what can we learn from those people because
Mm,
people do make mistakes, and also, and there are times people also do very wrong things, but we can learn
yeah.
from them. We
Yeah.
can learn from them, but we don't want to caricature people, right? We
Mm,
could learn, because it's leading to a lot of that mischaracterization of the past, as you said, is leading to something uh, that is manifested like the good example you use of looking at superhero films and or just movies generally. Most people go to movies for movies to lie to them, to give them the version of
yeah.
reality they prefer.
Mm,
But the reality is that certain things are just horrible. But even in the midst of the misery, people can find a way to build something out of it because out of those horrible periods of the past, some of the things that we have in the present, right, emerged. Now, one of the things, this is not a rationalization, that doesn't make the past better. But a good example is this. Right now, a lot of people, because of the technologies we have, are becoming eyewitnesses to war. They're
mm,
thinking the wars we see today are different from the past. That's absolutely not true. The past people didn't have smartphones and they couldn't record everything that way. The truth is, all wars are wars in which people go out there and obliterate people. They kill babies, they kill women, they kill everybody. And that there are people who even make mistakes. They even kill their own people. Wars are messy, horrible things. But movies give us versions of wars as precise operations where people neatly going and they get the bad guys and the good guys going, they rescue people. And that is a complete BS. That's just a false representation of that. The truth is, if you don't want to have the horrible things that we're now seeing in the world, the best way to do it is not to have wars at all.
mm,
See, we keep getting this lie. No, no, we just need to do wars better. That's complete nonsense. The truth of the matter is, as long as you're going to have things where people are going to have mobs who go in and burn down communities and so forth, we're going to have all these atrocities continue. The
mm,
truth is, we got to just not have those things done at all. So, look, we see ourselves as the good guys. By we, I mean, say, the allies who are like, Canada, the US, England, and those, right? But the fact of the matter is, what we did in Dresden and Berlin was just like what we're seeing happen, or in Tokyo is exactly
mm,
what happening in Gaza right now, to the letter. You see, there are so many examples of these things that were done. So and it doesn't mean that that exonerates what's being done today. It just means that maybe we haven't learned our lesson that we shouldn't get in these damn wars in the first place.
mm,
So there's a lot that could be learned. For instance, slavery was practiced for thousands of years. But the fact of the matter is, now we can learn things about slavery that say maybe we just shouldn't have slavery. I think
mm,
it's an improvement today that we could say slavery is wrong. You see what I'm saying? Now, there is still slavery, but it means we need to understand what's wrong with continuing it. You see?
mm,
So um, that's the thing, right? Again, I'm using the program's name to as a riff, right? But we have to re-educate ourselves. right? We need to understand and learn from those things, as uncomfortable as they are. There are things that we need to learn about them, which is, for instance, now when we try to think back of ourselves in that situation, we ask how things could have been different. What could be different? And the more we could think of how things could have been different, you know who we're really talking to? We're really talking to the present.
Mm,
Because we right now, it's scary. Right now in 2024, this may be listened to in the future. In March 2024, I look around the world as a person who not only studies horrible phenomena, but also study how to transform them. A lot of the world today, except for the environmental crisis, is looking like the way the world was in the late 1920s through 1930s.
mm,
And that is terrifying. You see, and if they want to know specifically, it's around fascism, enslavement, global racism, and imperial aspirations. Those were the combinations that led to World War II, death camps, and all of those things. We need to pay attention to what was done then. And we're facing similar kinds of decisions and are making similar kinds of wrong decisions.
mm.
So, there's a cliche that's attributed to George Santayana. Actually, it precedes him, but we could use George Santayana, who said, "Those who don't learn from history are bound to repeat it."
Mm,
The mistakes of history. Well, we should exercise our freedom and our intelligence. That's what education's about. And that means how are we going to learn from the mistakes if we don't know what the mistakes were?
mm,
And children are tougher than we think. There are a lot of things children can learn from and understand. And and I mean, we're adults who are children. I was fortunate when I was a child. My educators shared books with me and things that a lot of other people didn't get to read. I was fortunate to have access to those things, and I read them. Yeah, I read about slavery. I read about genocides. I read about class exploitation. I read about all kinds of. I read about the massacres of Native American communities. I learned a lot of those things. I learned about things that were done in the ancient world. Uh, what did I become? Oh, I became something terrible. I became a professor.
mm. But I want to say thank you again for joining in on this conversation. I think it's something that I'm excited to have for a much longer time and continuously retouch and learn more and understand how history has played a role into getting us to the world that we have today, and what is it that we can do intentionally and with awareness as we move forward. So thank you for all your insights and time.
Thank you again. It was a pleasure being on the program the first time and a pleasure again. Thank you so much.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.